This was one where you really didn't expect the result. Not good for Syracuse.
Not only that, Hudson, but it went down to the final 60th minute of the game between Syracuse and Harvard. And Jared, right when you thought that Syracuse was pretty much out of the game, even though it had been pretty much back and forth and they had a great start to this game, which we'll get into here in the show, Harvard left them with a Christmas present, a man-up opportunity with the final 2.5 minutes to go. But Syracuse scored one. They couldn't score the second. And like everyone mentioned, the Orange have dropped their first game ever to the Crimson of Harvard. A great game. Syracuse comes up short.
That man-up opportunity with 2 minutes to go was literally handing Syracuse the win on a silver platter, but Syracuse couldn't capitalize. And the reason why this game was so close in the first place, you look at Harvard, one man did it, Graham Stevens, 13 saves. He was like a brick wall out there. You couldn't get anything past him if you were Syracuse. And on the other end, Jimmy McCool, he had to be taken out of the game because of how many goals he was letting up. A complete 180 on both sides for each goalkeeper.
Harvard was brilliant on the goalkeeping end of things. Syracuse has some issues at the moment. We'll get into that here in the show. We'll also break down the fast start that Syracuse had in this game, but then it led to a back-and-forth affair, which we will break down, and how Syracuse ended up losing this thing 15-14 to Harvard, the second loss in a row for Syracuse after last weekend's defeat to Maryland. We'll break it all down. Stay with us here on the double overtime up until 4:30 right here on WAER.
The game may be over, but our coverage on WAER is not. Here on the double overtime, we'll be breaking down all the highs.
English charging at Cage, has an angle, shoots high, and connects with the back of the net. Stevens ahead for English. 4 seconds left. English has to run in. He skips it. 5-hole and scores. 1 second left. We're headed to overtime.
Passes behind the cage. A cutter in front, a behind the back, and a score. Syracuse strikes first against number 1, and Finn Thompson with the theatrics
and the lows.
Fine count in the world trouble. He turns it over. Duke on the fast break. 1-on-0. Sawada shoots high and scores high. Right down Broadway to English. Brings it off the pipe and out. How many of those have we seen today? Devastation. Denver beats Syracuse 10-8 in the 2024 NCAA Tournament quarterfinal.
Delivering our hottest takes along the way.
How do you not get up for this game? Like, I understand Duke is more angry, but Syracuse has probably more to prove than Duke does.
This did not look like previous games against Notre Dame. You can tell Syracuse is a completely different team as it's been for the last 3 to 4 seasons. When you're giving up 20 turnovers, when less than half of your shots are on goal, you can't be considering yourself a top 5 team. You can't be considering yourself back.
And I was shocked that they dominated this much, but this just shows you the difference with this team. One of the reasons Syracuse held on to win this game is because when they went up 12-8 in the fourth quarter, they kept winning faceoffs and were able to take a minute 20 off the clock, which limited the possessions Hopkins had in the fourth period.
Get your voice heard by calling in at 315-443-2011 or by tweeting us at WAER Sports Talk. It's the double overtime, and it starts right now.
Good afternoon, everybody, and with that, Syracuse falls to Harvard today, 15-14. Nico Horning, Jared Valentin here with you up until 4:30 this afternoon, as Syracuse has dropped its second-ranked game in a row after last weekend's loss to Maryland. Jared, a lot to break down in this game, from the strong start that Syracuse had, jumping out 5-0. But since then, boy, this Harvard squad played a completely different game than Syracuse, and the Orange just could not come up with anything down the stretch. It got into a back-and-forth affair, and then Harvard created a couple of separation goals there in the fourth quarter. Gave Syracuse a chance to come back with a cross-checking penalty from Andrew Glinsky there with 2.5 minutes to go in the fourth quarter, and that's where we're going to start with this game. If you'd like to call us in here at any time during the show, please feel free. 315-443-2011. You can also text us at 315-556-3929. Our Twitter's up and running, WAER Sports Talk, and our YouTube live stream as well. WAER Sports Talk as well if you would like to watch us today. All right, we can talk about the fast start. We can talk about the back-and-forth game that we had. But let's start in those final 2 minutes that Syracuse had, because it looked like for a while Syracuse is down 2. That clock just kept ticking in the fourth quarter. It was a very fast quarter, probably the fastest one out of all 4 of them today. And it seemed like Syracuse is going to run out of time. Andrew Glinsky got caught for a cross-checking penalty with 2.5 minutes to go. It was a non-releasable penalty, which means Syracuse can keep scoring with the amount of time that they had, in which this case was a 2-minute non-releasable. So it was a man up for Syracuse. Owen Hilt scores on one of the goals, cuts the lead down to just 1 for Harvard. So now it's a 1-goal game, under 2 minutes to go. Gary Gate uses another timeout as Syracuse gets the ball, and then from there, the Orange just could not get over that hump. A great finish in the game, but they came up short today, Jared.
I'm baffled. I'm still trying to process what I just witnessed, because I don't understand how, with a man-up opportunity, as golden of an opportunity as Syracuse got from Harvard in that final stretch, how you lose control of the ball on a man-up. When there's a man-up, that means that a lacrosse player on the opposing team is sitting out because of a penalty, right? So what that means is that Syracuse had more players on the field than Harvard. When you have more players on the field than Harvard, and when each person is being guarded by one person from the opposing team, there's always one person left open. How you lose the ball on a man-up opportunity, I don't understand. I don't understand how Syracuse couldn't get it past midfield when Billy Dwan had it on that final play.
Right.
How the ball it falls out of his stick, and then there's a scramble for it for about 5-6 seconds. Sam English gets it, and he sprints along the far sideline trying to get a good shot off before the time expires, and he just couldn't do it. I don't understand how they lost control of the ball in that final play.
Well, what's funny is obviously Dwan picked up that ground ball, got it up to English. They, with 10-15 seconds, you're sitting there towards Syracuse's own goal, and you're thinking, wow, this game's over. And then all of a sudden you see English just sprint ahead, and he did get a shot off, which was pretty remarkable in its own way. But the fact that Syracuse fumbled the ball for way too long in that final minute. The fact that they fumbled it in the first place was
unacceptable. That
was the separator.
That was the separator. That costed them the game after the fact that Syracuse had the chance with that penalty. Because down the stretch like that, you have to take care of the ball.
Correct.
You have to get it up midfield, especially when you get a steal like that, which Billy Dwan had. Because remember, Harvard had possession to start off that final play, and then Billy Dwan got a hold of it. He picks it up with his stick, which essentially was a miraculous that Syracuse had it in the first place. But then you can't capitalize because you can't get it up midfield.
Right.
Because you lose the ball and you get double teamed like Billy Dwan was briefly there, and he loses control, and then it takes those 5 extra seconds that it took for Sam English to get the ball. Those 5 seconds, Syracuse could have sprinted down the field and gotten a much better look than they did in the final seconds.
It's unacceptable. What suggestions do you guys have at home, possibly, or if you're on your drive back from the Dome today in those final couple of minutes? We'd love to hear your thoughts at 315-443-2011. Jared, unfortunately for Syracuse, this is a similar trap than what the Orange were facing last year with losing to ranked opponents later in the game. Now, granted, they lost in a few overtime games last year. Right, that was the separator last year, was overtime. Now we've come down to the fourth quarter, and we're just a few games in, and Syracuse has dropped one to Maryland on the road, a ranked team, and then they drop one here at home today against Harvard, also a ranked team, in the final minutes. A lot of high expectations right off the bat in this season, but for Syracuse to be able to play this close of a game and not come out on top after a really fast start, this team's got some question marks already. Just a few games in.
You mentioned the fourth quarter and how that was a fast game because no one was scoring and the clock was running down. But Syracuse's problems today started way before that.
Right.
Because early in the first, you mentioned Syracuse had a really good start. Owen Hilt gets 2 goals. John Mullen wins the first 3 faceoffs of the game. That helped Syracuse jump out to an early lead, especially coming off of Maryland, where Syracuse lost its first game of the season, but also had a slow third quarter. So Syracuse did everything that I wanted to see out of the gate to jump out in front and get that early lead. But when it started to turn was once Graham Stevens got into that rhythm.
Oh, he was brilliant today.
He was spectacular. He was the reason why Harvard won this game today, and we'll get into him and Jimmy McCool a little bit later in the show. But
well, real quick, he had that clutch save on Michael Leo with about a minute to go as well. After Owen Hiltz had scored that step-down goal to make it a one-goal game, Stevens, the freshman, came up
13
clutch.
saves today for
again,
Grant Stevens.
He was brilliant. And yes, we will get into that more, but it is of note that we should point him out right away because he saved Harvard a lot, and he allowed them to have some offensive execution in which their confidence...
He helped them offensively.
True.
Drastically.
Very true.
Because he gave them so many possessions.
Right. 100%. So, yeah, anyways, Harvard beats Syracuse today 15-14. Syracuse drops its second-ranked game of the season. Nico Horning, Jared Valentin here with you on the double overtime up until 4:30 this afternoon. Again, if you'd like to get here in on the conversation, you can call us at 315-443-2011. You can also text us at 315-556-3929. All right, Jared, let's get back to that fast start for Syracuse because the fourth quarter was the fourth. Not much scoring overall, just 2 goals for Syracuse. But this game started early on when Syracuse did have a strong start. And they scored 5 goals to start the game. And then Harvard slowly creeped back in the game. But what did you see from that first couple of minutes where Syracuse looked like a brilliant offensive team like they have for the most part of the season? Unfortunately, they let it slide a little bit there later in the first.
A couple things. One, John Mullen was fantastic, especially early in the game when he got those first 3 face-off wins. It should be noted that Harvard didn't get possession of the ball for the first 2 minutes and 10 seconds of the game. So Syracuse was scoring. Harvard couldn't even respond because they couldn't even get the ball because John Mullen was winning all those face-offs. So he did a really good job of getting Syracuse possession early, and that's how Syracuse was able to have that strong start that it did. But also, a lot of the goals that Syracuse did have today, Nico, Syracuse was moving without the ball, and people specifically were cutting, catching, shooting right away. They weren't holding onto the ball. The offense wasn't stagnant. And even later in the game, when Syracuse was still getting some of those goals, that's how they were doing it. There were several plays, and I want to point one out here. And we'll start with that hot start. Owen Hiltz. First goal, he scores less than a minute in. The second one, he gets the ball, immediately fires it, wastes no time scoring, or wastes no time dodging with the ball and moving with it. And he just catches it, shoots it right away, gets his second goal in less than 2 minutes. And it kept on later throughout the game. Finn Thompson had one in the third quarter, early in that third quarter, where he caught it, shot it on the right side of the goal, and Syracuse got its first goal in the third quarter. So for me, the two things was Johnny Mullen dominating with face-offs, especially early on, and the catch-and-shoot ability offensively that Syracuse had.
Mullen led this team to some great offense today. I think that can't be understated. He won 28 of his 31 face-offs today, and even
Harvard only won 4, by the way.
What was that?
Harvard only won 4 face-offs.
Correct, which is astronomical, to be honest, based on this.
They lost this game.
Correct. And if you think about last game, too, against Maryland, where every stat was nearly identical,
right,
except for Syracuse outshooting Maryland by 9, and they still ended up losing by 4. The stats are not adding up,
it's baffling.
And I don't know what the issue is to that. Maybe someone at home has an answer to that. You can call us at 315-443-2011. But I'd love to find out what that issue might be. Look, the face-off department at the beginning was great, and that allowed for some really quick goals because Mullen would win, and then Hiltz even had one. Towards the top of the slot, didn't rush, took his time, scored, did it again, and then, boy, Finn Thompson, what a day offensively for him. 5 goals, a career high. He also had an assist.
Only in 8 shots, too.
Correct. And
very efficient.
Owen Hiltz with 4 goals, couple of assists. I thought this offense started very fast because Joey Spallina did not force anything. And I said this in the season opener after the Jacksonville win, that Syracuse does not need to rely on Joey Spallina game in and game out because they have so many offensive weapons. It worked for them again today, where he had some assists early on, but he was not getting involved in the scoring. That's because they have other guys that they can go to. Mind you, Luke Roa was out of this game with an upper body injury. So the fact that Spallina wasn't doing much of the damage early on and let others get involved and not force anything, and Syracuse is taking a lot more time on their shot selection than they were last year, in my opinion, and not forcing anything, it proved to work for Syracuse in that first quarter.
I got to say, I was very impressed offensively early on with Syracuse because of the fact that Luke Roa wasn't playing. He had the upper body injury, was out for the entire game, and it didn't really feel like it early on because Owen Hiltz had those 2 goals. You mentioned Joey Spallina not forcing anything, and I want to get back to that in a little bit.
Sure.
But Sam English, as the game went on, did really well. Finn Thompson was just a monster today, 5 goals on only 8 shots like we mentioned, so he was very efficient. And Owen Hiltz, too, only on 10 shots, still very efficient. Syracuse was pretty efficient offensively. And I'll go back to that point about Spallina.
Sure.
1 goal, 3 assists on 6 shots. I said on Sports Night going into Maryland that I wanted him to have a big game, and he didn't. Syracuse lost. He wasn't really the reason per se why Syracuse lost because as you had that slow third quarter. But against lower ranked teams like this, it's great to see that other people went off today. That in Luke Roa's absence, in a game where Joey Spallina didn't have multiple goals, have Finn Thompson, Owen Hiltz, Sam English, all with hat tricks, and it speaks to this depth of the offense that you talk about, that Syracuse has so many players that it can rely on, that it doesn't need to
Correct.
have Joey Spallina go off. The reason why I said I wanted Spallina to do well, because he historically hasn't played the best in top 10 ranked games, and I think that was a mental hurdle that he needed to surpass on his own. But this offense, just as a team, is so well-rounded, and in that hot start, people not named Spallina were getting going early on.
Problem is they couldn't keep a lead, and to go off your point, Syracuse. It took 9 minutes for Graham Stevens, the Harvard goaltender, to make a save today. He allowed 5 straight goals. But after that, Stevens flipped the switch. The Syracuse goaltending found a problem, got into a rut, and we'll break that down here on the other side. As Syracuse falls to Harvard 15-14, the second straight loss for Syracuse men's lacrosse. Stick with us. We'll have some goaltending conversations and what Syracuse has to fix when we come back here on the Double Overtime on WAER.
Listening to the wings of a monarch butterfly. What a magical thought.
They arrive here on the Day of the Dead, which we celebrate here in Mexico, and a lot of the indigenous people believe that it's the souls of their ancestors that are returning, and it's very spiritual.
That's On Point with me, Meghna Chakrabarti.
From 7 to 8 on WAER, your local NPR station from the Newhouse School at Syracuse University.
There is a one-stop listen for everything Syracuse athletics.
You got great talent on this offense. You can't go dormant for an entire quarter. And
the Ostrom Avenue podcast provides unique opinions, plus exciting interviews from industry experts.
Joined by Georgia Tech play-by-play broadcaster Andy Demetra, Syracuse.com, football beat reporter Emily Laker.
Check out weekly interviews on YouTube and listen at WAER.org or wherever you get your podcast.
Listening to the wings of a monarch butterfly. What a magical thought.
They arrive here on the Day of the Dead, which we celebrate here in Mexico, and a lot of the indigenous people believe that it's the souls of their ancestors that are returning, and it's very spiritual.
That's On Point with me, Meghna Chakrabarti.
From 7 to 8 on WAER, your local NPR station from the Newhouse School at Syracuse University.
Far side. Here's Malone. Inside shot. Perry scores. Another quick stick shot for Andrew Perry, his second goal of the day.
Number 6, Syracuse falls to number 15, Harvard, 15-14 inside the Dome. Welcome back to the Double Overtime. Jared Valentin, Nico Horning breaking down this loss up until 4:30. Give us your thoughts. Let us hear your frustrations because we did not like what we just witnessed coming into this game. So
embarrassing.
Get your thoughts on the air. Embarrassing is the perfect word to describe it. Call in 315-443-2011. Shoot us a text at 315-556-3929 and interact with us on Twitter and YouTube at WAER Sports Talk. Nico, we talked about the hot start that Syracuse had. We talked about the final stretch and what a whirlwind that was. But the story of this game was the goalkeepers on both sides. Graham Stevens for Harvard, Jimmy McCool for Syracuse. One was fantastic, and the other not so much.
Stevens was brilliant. That was very impressive. As good as the Syracuse offense was, and as far as the fast start that they got off to with a 5-0 lead, Stevens was not flustered, and he ended up settling in and being able to stop this Syracuse offense, which was extremely impressive. He had a .500 save percentage in that second quarter after finding his ground and leveling things off. That was one of the most important notes in this game for the goaltender. Stevens had a .500 save percentage at halftime as well, and he kept it going on and on throughout the game. And then, of course, he makes that great clutch save on Michael Leo there with a minute to go on the man-up opportunity for Syracuse with Harvard up by 1. And he's just a freshman. So Stevens was great today, and
his third collegiate start.
Right. He was brilliant. Talk about a great test offensively to go up against if you're Stevens. He was extremely impressive. Great game. The Syracuse offense did their thing for the most part, but it was just the goaltending for Syracuse and the defense that really was not good.
I mean, he was dipping, he was ducking, he was diving. I said it earlier, he was like a brick wall defensively because no one could get anything throughout. No one on Syracuse's side could get anything through him, it seemed like, at some points to the game. I wanted to get to a text that we got from Randy and Austin. They said, guys, Syracuse isn't even close to a national championship contender right now, which is sad based on the expectations. A lot of, quote, dumb turnovers by experienced guys is very concerning. Don't get me wrong, all credit to Harvard's goalie, but to win big games, you're going to have to beat good goalies. You have to.
Well, I got 2 points off of that, Randy. I totally agree with the turnover thing because even Spallina had a couple of turnovers today where he might have been maybe getting the ball and then had some bad pass, or he went behind the back with a pass and it went too far and he turned it over. There were some tough mistakes later in the game offensively, especially with that Spallina pass that was too high with 3.5 minutes to go in the fourth quarter, that I think ultimately led Syracuse to losing this game 15-14 to Harvard here on WAER Syracuse. And those mistakes cost Syracuse the game ultimately. And I think Randy's got a great point.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with his point on if you want to be the best, you got to beat good goalies.
Correct. And by the way, the other thing off of that with the national contender is it's really a tough scenario because Syracuse has one of the best offenses in the country.
Yeah.
That cannot be understated.
One of the most deep offenses, too.
Correct. But the goaltending has always been a question mark coming into the year, and it really hasn't been tested that much until the last couple games. And then the defense has been whatever, but I think the goaltending has been the main issue. And Jimmy McCool did not have a good game today.
No.
At all.
Not at all.
He was slow. His reaction time was not good. He got beat low time and time again. You think any sport you got to make adjustments, all right? I don't care what sport you're playing. I don't care what position you're playing. You make adjustments throughout the game. Jimmy McCool made 0 adjustments to try and stop the shots that were going low to him or coming at him. And with that, Coach Gates, like, you know what? We're going to go to the sophomore Michael Ippoliti.
We're going to adjust, and we're going to go to Michael Ippoliti.
So the problem with me today was McCool. They kept going down low. Harvard had like 4 or 5 goals where they kept scoring down low. And at one point, you'd think that McCool would expect that. And I know you were talking a little bit earlier, Jared, off the air, that you thought he was maybe one post, near one post versus the other. I don't think that was the main issue. I just think he could not defend the low shots, and he did not make adjustments. That's what brought Ippoliti into the game.
How can Syracuse's goalies improve? Let us know. 315-443-2011. That's the number to call. The number to text, 315-556-3929. You can also check us out on Twitter and YouTube at WAER Sports Talk. Jared Valentin and Nico Horning breaking down Syracuse's 15-14 loss to Harvard here on the Double Overtime. I like your point about the reaction time, especially because he was not getting low enough in time to beat those balls that were low-angled and bouncing off the turf into the goal.
And you know how tough it is to be a goaltender in lacrosse. That thing's coming at you
100 miles
right
an hour.
away. You have no time to react. So this doesn't go for every game as far as the reaction time because it's extremely tough, and I feel for these guys. But when you don't make adjustments to defend where the same shot is going from the opposition over and over and over and over again, then there's a problem.
You have to improvise, you have to adapt, and you have to overcome it. Specifically in that second half, you mentioned the low shots. Harvard scored a goal 3.5 minutes into the second half off of a low shot. When Harvard trailed by 2 at the half, they cut it to 1. And then a couple of minutes later, Kenny Malone beats Jimmy McCool with another low shot. McCool doesn't move in time. That tied the game at Harvard. That tied the game for Harvard at 10. And then after that, Michael Ippoliti comes into the game, and then Harvard would get its first lead of the game. So it's all about those adjustments. Like for a guy like Jimmy McCool, there was nothing made, like you mentioned. No adjustments made. For me, what I saw, like you mentioned, he was a little too committed to one side of the goal for me. He was a little bit too lenient on one side of the posts, and Harvard was a lot of times on the side that he was committing to, but was shooting it in the opposite direction, so it would land in that open space that McCool was leaving wide open.
And credit that offense with great shot selection today on the Harvard end of things. You know, they were really good. And I thought there was good shot selection on both sides, but Kenny Malone, for instance, he ended up with a great game, 4 goals today, another assist, and a lot of the shots that they were taking were just good selection. And even part of that selection is knowing, you know what, this guy's not defending the low ball very well, let me keep shooting it there, and that's how they ended up scoring.
And I want to go back to the topic at hand about Graham Stevens.
Yeah.
I said it earlier, he carried this team. Defensively, offensively, he helped both sides of the ball with his play today. He was the reason why Harvard had so many more possessions than they should have. This game felt, in the beginning, Syracuse had way more possessions. They held on to the ball for the first 2-ish minutes of the game. Harvard didn't have it. Later on in the game, it felt like Harvard had the ball for most of it. Because you look at the numbers, Syracuse beat Harvard in terms of face-offs won 28-4. Harvard only won 4 face-offs today. And then you go to the ground balls, Syracuse won 40-24. Harvard was outmatched in ground balls and face-offs. But you want to know how Harvard, the Crimson, were getting the ball down the field constantly? It's because Graham Stevens was making save after save. Time after time, he was stepping up. He dipped, he dove, he ducked, he dodged. He did what he had to do to grab the ball in the crease, in the goalpost, and gave Harvard possession when Harvard didn't win faceoffs and didn't claim ground balls. So you do all the right things on the defensive side besides stopping shots going into the net. You limit the ground balls, you limit the face-off victories, but you still lose. That's what's really disappointing to me.
Embarrassing. And now you got to think of where Syracuse goes from here with the goaltending between Jimmy McCool and Michael Ippoliti based on today's performance. Ippoliti ended up with a .444 save percentage. McCool just .333. And now you got Utah next weekend in Salt Lake City. So you wonder, where is this goaltending unit going to go?
Twice as many goals allowed as saves today for Jimmy McCool.
It was brutal.
It was certainly brutal. Syracuse falls to Harvard 15-14 inside the JMA Wireless Dome. When we return on the double overtime, we'll welcome Jake Klein, our WAER sports talk reporter from inside the Dome. He saw all the action unfold. He'll give us his thoughts on the goalies, the offense, the defense, everything that took place today. He'll be joining us when we return on the double overtime.
Thanks for listening. We hope you're enjoying this WAER sports broadcast. Our sports staff goes where the teams go, home and away, and prepare for days before each game broadcast. Our talk show and podcast hosts analyze games, pour over stats, and keep up on sports trends. These and many behind-the-scenes opportunities are made possible by listener donations. So if you're a fan or an alum, donate to keep our sports legacy strong at WAER.org and click donate.
Listening to the wings of a monarch butterfly. What a magical thought.
They arrive here on the Day of the Dead, which we celebrate here in Mexico, and a lot of the indigenous people believe that it's the souls of their ancestors that are returning, and it's very spiritual.
That's On Point with me, Meghna Chakrabarty.
From 7 to 8 on WAER, your local NPR station from the Newhouse School at Syracuse University.
Syracuse on the backup. It's an excellent try. The Orange get it right back. Hiltz passes in front. A shot by English and a goal. If at first you don't succeed, try again.
Well, Syracuse kept on trying after blowing a 5-0 lead and couldn't win the back-and-forth battle in a 15-14 loss to Harvard. And with that, we bring on our talk reporter who was in the Dome today, Jake Klein. And Jake, boy, a great start offensively for Syracuse. And then, obviously, a very back-and-forth aspect of a game there in the fourth quarter. Ended up going down to the final minute and final second of the game. But first off, Jake, what are your initial thoughts here in those last couple of minutes where Syracuse ultimately fell short?
Well, Syracuse looked all out of sorts, Nico. I thought down the stretch there, even after Gary Gait called a couple of timeouts down the stretch and had time to draw up a play, his team did get the ball back with about 15 seconds left and made an effort up the field, even had what Gary Gait called an open net on the final opportunity there, but Graham Stevens, who was just tremendous all day, came up big one last time, and Harvard pulls it out.
Yeah, Jake, and I want to go back to one of the bright spots of Syracuse today, and early on, it was the play of, and really throughout, honestly, not even just early on, it was the play of John Mullen at the faceoff X. 28 faceoffs won today by Syracuse. I know it doesn't show up in the win column because Syracuse lost this game, but I thought that was very important for Syracuse early on, and I thought that was a big reason why Syracuse still was in it, despite the Jimmy McCole letting goals go into the net over and over again.
That was the only reason that Syracuse was in it, despite the goaltending. John Mullen almost single-handedly kept Syracuse in the game. You just said it at the end of that last segment, Jared. 4 face-off wins for Harvard. And to their credit, Jerry Byrne and his coaching staff made an adjustment. They knew at some point, probably after they went down 5-0, look, we're not going to win a whole lot of faceoffs in this game. And instead of trying to beat John Mullen on faceoffs, they focused on, hey, what's the approach going to be once John Mullen wins the faceoff? Let's try to get him to win the faceoff backwards and give ourselves time to substitute and get the team on the field that we want defensively. And when you couple that with the way Graham Stevens played in net, I mean, you can win without winning faceoffs, but you have to do everything else right, and Harvard
Graham Stevens did that today, for sure.
Harvard did everything else right.
He was brilliant, and Harvard ended up really kind of weathering the storm early on as Syracuse falls to Harvard 15-14. That's Jake Klein there in the Dome. I'm Nico Horning alongside Jared Valentin up until 4:30 here on the Double Overtime. And Jake, you know, we can talk about the face-offs. We can talk about John Mullen. We can talk about a multitude of things today. But, you know, with the Harvard goaltending and Stevens really coming up clutch after allowing the first 5 goals of the game, what did you see from him to maintain his confidence and comfortability to end up leveling things out? And then his offense obviously ended up following him.
Well, Graham Stevens said after the game, as we watched Lemoyne and Lafayette warm up.
There we go. I was wondering what was going on there behind you.
In the Dome at 5 o'clock.
Nice.
Graham Stevens said after the game, like, the key for him was to feel the ball once in his stick. The first 5 Syracuse shots got by him. You came out here, if you're Syracuse, and you did exactly what you needed to do. You peppered a true freshman goalie who had never played in an environment like this, probably never played in front of a crowd this big.
He felt like a veteran today.
And you put 5 past him before he ever touched the ball. It was 5-0. And he said the key for him was to just get the ball in his stick, on the clear, on a pass. And when Joost de Koning forced a turnover in the corner, when Syracuse had the ball up 5-0, looking to go 6-0, they get the ball to Graham Stevens. He feels it in his stick. They make the clear. Harvard gets on the board 5-1. And from there, it was like Graham Stevens was a totally different person. And Jerry Byrne credited that play by Joost de Koning as the one that changed the game.
Yeah, Jake, you could tell that Graham Stevens, that his goal was to just simply get the ball in his stick, because one of the things I mentioned before the break was that Harvard had so many possessions because of Graham Stevens and because he helped clear the ball down midfield, and by getting those saves, he helped Harvard get so many possessions. Syracuse won the face-offs like we talked about, and the ground balls battle. But it didn't feel like that, and it didn't feel like that based on the discrepancy that that it actually was. 28-4 in the face-off wins. That feels like one team has the ball the entire game and the other doesn't. And it did not feel like that because Graham Stevens caught the ball in his stick several times and helped give Harvard those extra possessions.
Well, the other thing Jake was mentioning was that, he had to feel the ball. He didn't feel the ball for the first 9 minutes based on actually saving something in the net, right?
And you couldn't tell by the end because of how great of a job he did as the game went on.
But Syracuse let him get into that groove. So many of SU's shots in this game were right at Graham Stevens. And, at some point, it's the Dome, it's a big crowd, it's Syracuse, it has the program history. But at some point, you're the number 1 goalie recruit in the nation in last year's high school class. The guy knows how to play goalie. And when you shoot right at him, he's going to save it. When you shoot with no traffic in front of the net, with nothing blocking him, Graham Stevens is going to save it. He's that good. And what Harvard did that Syracuse did not was make its possessions count. And Syracuse had so many more possessions, but so many more empty possessions. Think of all the sloppy turnovers that Syracuse made in this game. A Spolina pass,
that was brutal.
Maybe 15 yards, totally uncontested, just sails it over and past the end line. Syracuse came out here as if they knew they were just going to wipe the floor with Harvard and didn't even come close.
And I think that's where this team is at right now, is all the national championship talk and conversations. And everyone's got to slow down because we're only a few games in. This team has now lost. Yeah, well, this team has now lost 2 games against ranked opponents in a row. And, yes, this offense is great. We saw it early on. We saw it throughout. But this team's got other issues, and one of those issues just got exposed today that's been a question mark all year, and that is the goaltending. You go from Jimmy McCool to Michael Ippoliti, and Jake, it was not a good day for the goaltending end of things, especially with McCool. And the biggest thing that stuck out to me, you can mention what you saw, but I didn't see any adjustments from Jimmy McCool because Harvard beat him down low time and time again.
Yeah, I did not agree with the decision of Gary Gate to pull Jimmy McCool in that situation. Okay. Yes, wow. there were 10 goals allowed and 5 saves, and that's not good. There's no doubting that. But some of these shots that Harvard was taking were, true rips. There were a couple back-to-backers that Harvard had by Owen Gaffney and by Logan Ipp, and they just pinged him in off the post past McCool from 15, 20 yards out. And those are legit shots. Like, Harvard, in my eyes, up front, is a more talented team than the team Syracuse lost to a week ago today in Maryland. They have better talent up front. They have Sam King, they have Logan Ipp, Jack Spidell. We saw their depth with Gaffney and Teddy Malone, who had a couple, and Miles
Teddy Malone
Botkiss.
was great today.
Well, we saw it vividly that Harvard had some really, really good shots. And some of those you just cannot defend. However, I thought there were a stretch of goals that kept going down low, and McCool did not just make any quick adjustment to at least have a chance at saving some of those.
Especially in the beginning of the
every
second half.
shot's different, though. You can't
True, but
say...
I just thought that Harvard kept going to the same spot because they thought that McCool couldn't defend it. He didn't make any adjustments in those same spots that you need to. And it's tough to say every time.
Was Michael Ippoliti any better?
A little bit.
I didn't think so.
He was at least a little bit better, but he wasn't. I just think Syracuse needed to change. I think Coach Gate made the right move to at least get a fresh guy in there because it felt like Harvard was going to pour it on there any second.
I think the damage you do to Jimmy McCool's psyche and what he thinks of his standing on this team by pulling him from the game is worse for you long term than if you just let him in there and maybe Harvard wins by 2 or 3 instead of 1.
Do you think that ruins his confidence going forward? If
it
he's
would ruin mine.
Like this?
It sure would ruin mine. If you come in and you are the goalie, the starter, the leader on this team, and it's your first opportunity to be that guy, and you have that taken away, I don't care who you are, that messes with you. And it happened to Will Mark last year, and Jimmy McCool came in for him, and McCool saw it from that side. And was Will Mark a superstar down the stretch last season? No, he was not. And so if that Duke game in the ACC tournament last year was the turning point when Gary Gate pulled Will Mark, if that was the turning point in Will Mark's season, well, you better hope it's not the turning point in Jimmy McCool's season, or else it's going to be a long year.
Jake, I want to go back to your point that you talked about of Harvard's offense and how they were being so efficient with the ball. Look at some stats from the first half. Syracuse had 5 saves. Harvard had 10. Harvard had twice as many saves as Syracuse did. And if you look at the shots and the shots on goal, it was roughly somewhat even, but not really, because Syracuse had 31 shots, Harvard just 19. 20 of SU's 31 shots were on goal. And still, this game was only a 2-point game because of how great of a job Graham Stevens did today. And on the flip side, 13 of Harvard's 19 shots was on goal, and Harvard was still within arm's reach despite having less shots than Syracuse did. I think if I'm Gary Gate, I take Jimmy McCool out in that moment and try something else, because that can't keep happening going into the second half, because that's only going to snowball. And granted, Syracuse still lost, but still, I got to make some sort of adjustment, especially if I see that Jimmy McCool's not making an adjustment within himself in the goalpost.
I think at that point you have to make a judgment call as head coach, and you have to say, is the damage I could do by making this move, the long-term damage, is that worth the chance that Michael Ippoliti comes in and locks it down and we come back and win this game on February 22nd, I remind you.
Right. You know what? I totally agree with Jake. However, I think this is a totally different situation than last year. And I understand your point with McCool coming in for Will Mark, but Will Mark was I would say, step up goaltending-wise. He was one of the best. And, you know, that's where I'm a little iffy, where it's like you have more flexibility this year for sure between two guys that were, you know, in training camp fighting for the same position, where you knew that Will Mark the last couple of years was the guy. So I think you have a little bit more flexibility to make those adjustments. But, you know, for you, Jake, let's take a little bit of a step back here with, you know, you lose these last 2 games against ranked opponents. Now you go to Salt Lake City, you play Utah before you come right back here and get ready for a very good Johns Hopkins team. Where does this team go from here goaltending-wise? Because everyone knows the offense is pretty solidified, but they got to make some adjustments on some other departments.
Yeah, I hate to spoil it, Nico, but Gary Gates said post-game pretty outright, Jimmy McCool is still the starter for this team. So
for sure, as you'd expect.
He'll be right back in there next time. But yeah, I mean, Syracuse certainly has some things to clean up, and a lot of what Harvard did in the middle stretch of this game, where they were kind of hanging around and then finally broke through and took the lead, was exactly what Maryland did last Saturday. And that was slow Syracuse down. Do not let them get out in transition. Do not let them cause turnovers in the neutral area between the restraining lines, and let them fly in the opposite direction. Slow them down. Make them play from a settled offense. Make them run past you. Make them beat you. Syracuse has been so dreadful in those settled offense situations, and I think that's where this team needs to elevate. I don't know if they have the personnel to do that. I don't know if they have that elite dodger that we've seen from some of the other elite teams in college lacrosse over the last few years. I don't see that person on Syracuse's roster, so they're going to have to find some other way, whether it's through ball movement or better sets, to get that, to generate offense from those settled possessions, because right now they're just not doing it.
Jake, to your point earlier about Jimmy McCool and his confidence, if he's going to be the starter going forward, like Gary Gate mentioned after the game, this next game is going to be very telling to see what he does and how he bounces back. The good news is, to your point, if he's the starter going forward, he has plenty of chances, because it's only late February, to get that confidence back up, even though he was taken out to get today. But this next game for me is going to be very telling with how he responds and how many goals he lets up.
I agree. I think it could be indicative of how the rest of the season goes, whether or not Jimmy McCool can bounce back.
Well, we'll see what happens next weekend in Salt Lake City between Syracuse and Utah. Jake, thanks so much for hopping on here. Enjoy the rest of this sunny afternoon here in Syracuse after you get outside of the Dome.
Thanks, guys.
All right, that was Jake Klein, our talk reporter here today, following a Syracuse loss to Harvard 15-14. Nico Horning, Jared Valentin wrap it up shop here on the double overtime. And with that, it's time for our final words here on the double overtime. Jared, I'll start with you. A lot of departments you can go in today, especially considering that with the high hopes and aspirations that the Syracuse team has, you're already facing some issues after 2 straight games lost against ranked opponents. Where are you going with this one?
Yeah, and look, you mentioned the expectations that this team has. It's championship or bust, right? And if you want to get there, a loss like today is flat out unacceptable. Syracuse fell 15-14 to Harvard. Harvard ranked number 15. Syracuse ranked number 6. Syracuse dominated in faceoffs. We talked about that all show long. Won 28 faceoffs out of 32. Harvard only won 4. Go to the ground ball battle in today's game. Syracuse had 40 ground balls. Harvard only had 24. The fact that you won both of those margins and you still lost is unacceptable, especially when you have these aspirations to go all the way to the championship after losing to Denver in the quarterfinals last year. You have to dominate every aspect of the game. Face-offs, ground balls. You look at the turnovers. Syracuse and Harvard had the same amount of turnovers. Okay. Harvard had more clears than Syracuse. Harvard's Graham Stevens dominated. 13 saves, gave Harvard so many possessions after Syracuse had started out hot. We mentioned it already how this game didn't feel like it should have. When you dominate the face-off battle 28-4, that would anyone would hear that and think that that team that won the face-off battle had the ball the entire game and dominated. And that's not what happened today. Syracuse trailed despite winning those battles. And this comes after a loss to an even better Maryland team where Syracuse let up 4 unanswered goals in the third quarter. You come back today, you get off to a good start, but you fall flat once Graham Stevens adjusts and fixes it out. This loss is flat out unacceptable because of the expectations this team has. And if they want to reach those goals, something has to change.
Well, I think you got to stop with the expectations. You know, you want to look to the national championship. You want to look to the playoffs so bad. But at some point, you have to come to reality. And I think Syracuse came to sort of a reality today when they answered one of those question marks, in my opinion, that has been daunting them all season long here in the first few games and coming into the year, and that's been the goaltending. So I think that this Syracuse team only goes as far as its goaltending. That is my final word because it got exposed today. Syracuse jumped out to a 5-0 lead offensively, and then they let everything blow from there. And you had Jimmy McCool with a .333 save percentage. That's not good. Allowed 10 goals, had 5 saves. And then you bring in Michael Ippoliti, who had a .444 save percentage. And you do not have Will Mark. So, in my estimation, this offense was so good last year, and they had a Will Mark. They had that goaltending that they can rely on. I don't know how the season is going to go, if I'm going to be honest with you, because you have a great offense, maybe a little bit better than last year, but your goaltending drops off. And that's where I'm really scared for this team to see how they can do going forward, especially against ranked teams. And that's been the talk as well coming into the season was how would they do against ranked opponents? Well, we've had that question answered as well against Maryland and Harvard, both ranked teams there in the top 20. So with that, we thank you so much for joining us here on the Double Overtime on WAER. Syracuse drops it to Harvard today, 15-14. Nico Horning and Jared Valentin. Our next basketball broadcast is on Wednesday. That's right, Syracuse has had some time off since last Tuesday. They'll take on NC State Wednesday night. McClurg Remodeling countdown to tip-off at 6:30 before a 7 o'clock tip-off with the Double Overtime right back in here up until 11 o'clock. Andrew Della Piana, our engineer today, and Charlie Fellows will be on the post-game show for that. So that'll be Syracuse and NC State on Wednesday. Next lacrosse game is Saturday when Syracuse travels to Utah in Salt Lake City. 2 o'clock face-off on Saturday. And there's also a basketball game going on at the same time when Syracuse heads down to Blacksburg to take on Virginia Tech. That is a noon game, so no countdown to face-off for lacrosse, but we'll have you covered for pregame action for basketball at 11:30 a.m. on Saturday. A couple of thank yous to hand out. We've got our producer, Alex Burstein, putting together a great show, quick show as well here this afternoon. Our engineer, as I pointed out a minute ago, Andrew Della Piana. Our talk reporter, who we heard from in the Dome, Jake Klein, and as well as our WAER Sports Talk Desk, Evan Edmonston, Cole Purvis, and Ryan Croak. Thanks to their help as well, putting together the social media and everything that made this broadcast possible. With that, Syracuse falls to Harvard 15-14, a disappointing loss in the Dome. It went back and forth all throughout after a quick 5-0 start for Syracuse in the first quarter. Nico Horning, Jared Valentin, happy to do it here on WAER. Again, we'll be back on Wednesday for Syracuse and NC State men's basketball. Hope you can join us then at 6:30 for McClurg Remodeling countdown to tip-off ahead of that 7 o'clock game. All right, have a great rest of your afternoon. Enjoy the sunny weather before the snow comes back here in a few days. Good afternoon, everybody.